Seawall by Samuel Lee Brewerton. The grotesque majority of aristocrats are literally just estate paperweights. On occasion, however, you get some spoiled autistic Homo sapien named Graf von Motherfucking Zeppelin, who risked 1,000 years of inheritance to build a floating empire whose aura shall never be mogged. Spire. The Wall breeds two chief spire families. Simple spire, the exposed personal ascent craft of the cliffknot. Simple spire head spike, sail canopy. Jet key, periscope interface, studs bloom cage. Carriage spire, the enclosed cabin-bearing variant for lords, officers and freight. Both use a blooming canopy to take or shed the wind, a head spike to dock, a tail spike to steady descent, and a periscope-guided control line for precision flying. Both dock vertically into honeycomb spire cells in Zeppelin bellies or station ceilings. Seawall, the red Raja volume WAD, wave spawn. Macra Magnetomafia presents Serak, var Rothrexa, planet Ceres Prime. Ceres Prime. Serak, Lebesta. Seawall, continent of Serak, Old Valathian word for seawall. The continent consists of two unequal halves. The summit realm sits atop the rim of the seawall. The fractured realm falls on the cliff face below the sky lake. Old Velation var Kolvatrak, Dairy First Hook Spire. Drop var Ivensail Suvris, Last Light Deepnail. Var Cauldron. Senok. Line through text indicates speech via tug talk, a mode of non-verbal communication performed by tugging a rope in specific patterns that give meaning like words and phrases. One can either visually identify the tug patterns if the communicating parties are separated, or feel the patterns if they are in close proximity, and each is holding the end of a signal rope. Underlined text indicates knotted rope that forms a script known as line law. The summit realm uses a multicolor visual version called braids, which requires various ropes. The fractured realm uses a simpler monocolor variant that is meant to be sensed by touch, but can also be read visually if there is light to see it. The world is a cliff, and men make thrones on ledges. The ocean remembers nothing. The wind remembers for it, hauling memory up the face proverb from the old Lebestrian line law. Red orbit 87, red epoch, readjustment. Red orbit 896, turn of the 2nd century of the Tyrian barony. The Velethian mothership eased in over Condor like a slow verdict, a jet black zeppelin nearly 150 meters in length. Below it, the southern tail of Serak broke into ridges and cut rock, wind-scoured, jagged, unfinished. The eastern mountains ran down from Velethia in a hard line and ended here at Condor, as if the world narrowed to one last tooth. To the west, a parallel range climbed back north in strict array. Between them, the valley held its great lake, dark and still at its center, churning at its edges where rivers hit and became falls which fed the sky lake. The cityscape below wrapped the mountain on every side, terraces and tiers stepping down the slopes like stacked stone waves. Condor's castle sat on a stone column that rose straight out of the mountain's summit, like the peak had been pulled upward and narrowed into a single shaft. Its surface was grey, brined through with black salt that filled the cracks in long, tar-dark seams. A thick branch of red and yellow crispus wound around it in a slow spiral, climbing the column like a living claim, staked in bark and leaf. The castle clung to the top of the structure, a crown on a finger of rock. The morning was dark with mist and cloud as a storm rolled in. The engines hummed through the mothership's cabin. At the helm, the command pilot worked the approach, while light ahead pierced the fog. He eased the throttle forward and turned the wheel. It answered with a repeating click at each degree. He pressed a red button on the dash. A label line lit, single string, semantic knots tied down it reading, "Final approach." Red lights began flashing through the mostly empty cabin, striking the dark central promenade in intervals. At the base, the entrance hall held low orange light, stained darker by black wood paneling. The ramp door sat at the far end, angled up at 45 degrees. Brass rails glinted along both sides. 4 owls sat perched on the lip of a small hangar cut into the curve of the ceiling. Final approach. Final approach. Below them, Emperor Hakfelethion helped Princess Ceres with her respirator. He twisted the nozzle at the mask. It hissed. White air bled from the seals, then stopped when the valve closed. "Now turn around," he said. The girl obeyed. The tank on her back swayed. Hack reached to the other end of the tube where it fed into a wall valve and twisted that one too. Hiss. Seal. He fixed the line into the tank on Ceres's back with a final push and click. "There," he said, standing. "Deep breaths." Ceres breathed. The tube chattered wet with each pull. Hack watched a dial on her tank dance to the rattle. The wall was lined with respirators. Their mouth tubes sat disconnected, both ends fixed into valves. Buttons and colored indicator lights crowded the panel like a switchboard map. Two soldiers prepared themselves for foreign air. They tested the tubes at their masks, uncoupled the wall ends, then clicked and adjusted the supplement levels, watching the dials sway. Huck fixed his own helm to his head, an ivory owl with black eyes and a violet beak. "Why do I have to wear this?" Ceres whined, her voice echoed by the respirator. "The red and yellow crispus is not our mother tree," said Hack. "She will find our lungs and set fire to them if we're not careful." The owls above groomed their wings. "Why did you even bring me here?" Ceres complained. "I want to go back to Thevarthol." Hack dropped to one knee to meet her level while he finished the neck seal. He took her by the shoulders and looked into the round lenses of her mask. "Well," he said softly, "it's important that a princess learn diplomacy. You're going to observe while I negotiate with the king of New Condor." "Diplomacy?" asked Ceres, unsure. Shai was not always a king. He needed help to become one. YSQ held this region for over 400 years and crushed every rebellion before his, Huck said. "As emperor, I had to think about the situation diplomatically. No emperor of Velithia before me had ever made lasting peace with YSQ, so I took the risk of funding Shai's ascension." "Why?" asked Ceres. "Why do it if it was a risk?" "Diplomacy is made of risks. A battle is postponed in hopes your opponent does not cut your throat at the parley," said Huck. He pressed a finger to Ceres's throat. She felt her pulse against it. Her father leaned close. "A war to the north waits for Velithane to enter it alone and burn, while mothers of dead cliff knots cry." His voice came louder there, almost out of line. Ceres's eyes widened behind the lenses. The owls stared down with feigned interest. Hack lifted his finger from her throat. His voice settled again. "But through diplomacy, Velithane will not have to face Asteria alone." A moment was given to the hum of the engines. Ceres pondered, then spoke. "What if diplomacy fails?" she asked. "Will Velithane have to fight Asteria and Condor at the parley?" Hack chuckled. "I'll have to explain parley later." "Is that why Mummy screamed and cried when we flew away?" asked Ceres. Hack cradled Ceres' respirator in a gloved palm. "No, I have other options before my hand is forced to multi-front conflict." His thumb ran over her cheekbone. Then he touched his helm softly to hers and stood. "Come, Ceres," said Huck, taking her by the hand. "Let's get your coat." Ceres turned as the guards came up the hall past her, helping a limping figure who struggled and leaned into the walls as they brought him down the dark passage. Hack led her around a corner into a closet nook. As the guards brought the figure past, making strange groaning noises, she caught a glimpse of the back of his scalp between the masks escorting him. Bald and bruised, with a few long strands of hair still clinging to it. Sores oozed pus and blood like scattered barnacles. Her eyes stayed fixed on the doorway while her coat was put on her as if she were a lifeless doll. The skydock reached for the mothership. A cantilevered arm of stone and timber thrust from Condor's spired castle, braced below by arches that vanished into mist. Corvette zeppelins in red and yellow striping flanked the approach. Dock workers caught the zeppelin's anchor rope and ran it to the iron link at the end of the cantilever. They cinched it down until the hull stopped drifting. Idle engines drizzled exhaust straight up. From a distance it looked as if the castle was smoking a black cigar. Hydraulics hissed as the cabin ramp lowered. The 4 owls darted out first, Two broke to either side of the dock, then snapped into dives. The rock pillar seemed to sprint upward as the birds fell like ivory bullets before an endless blackboard. The ramp touched stone just after Hack did. Ceres was his shadow. The morning air of Condor struck cold through a coat built for another climate. Her respirator clicked faster as her breath shortened. Behind them, the two healthy soldiers helped the limping one forward, now sealed into a respirator helm that did nothing to help him move. Lampposts lined the dock displaying enemy dead, each hung inverted as a grim totem, torso and head facing inward toward the pad. The binding had taken the limbs behind the torso, breaking and knotting them into a fixed X, arms drawn up and out, legs dragged down and apart. What hung nearest the viewer was the straight drop of stomach, chest, throat, and head. The rest opened behind it like a cruel sigil made from skin and bone. Trailing Huck, Ceres stared through fogging lenses at each mangled corpse, as though it were a museum display. Hack's eyes stayed on the forest of lances and banners carried by the guards ahead. There stood King Shai Condor. He wore dark red robes strapped in black leather and buckled in copper. The buttons ran in a line down the center, each one a square-cut sapphire glimmering in the flaring lamplight. Prince Shard stood at his side in robes of the same design, but yellow. They, and the soldiers cupping around them, were barefaced, an obvious sign of dominion in their own territory. Hack passed the last lamppost. Ceres stopped. The latter of the clamped men was still breathing. His face no longer looked like a face. Her eyes snapped to his left arm as one finger twitched. A cliffknot changed his grip on the limping figure's arm, reached out and shoved Ceres forward as they caught up. Her head stayed, turned toward the ruined man for a moment, then came back. The lone emperor stood before the guarded king and his heir. The crack of capes and banners thrashing in the wind filled the moment. Above and back along the hull, at the cantilever's root, two low-profile camouflage pods sat flush with the crown, their reflective skins breaking the ship's silhouette. Each housed a three-man team, respirated and locked into position around heavy spin-shot cannons. The barrels ran forward through tight apertures, long and steady despite the wind shear. One man in each pod held the firing seat, shouldered into the frame, eye pressed to a large telescopic scope scaled to the barrel, crosshair laid into the glass. The others worked range and feed, hands moving in small, exact corrections. They tracked the collision of power ahead in controlled arcs, passing targets between pods without overlap. Set just behind the pods, prone along the curvature of the hull, 4 additional spin-shot marksmen lay flattened into the surface, their profiles broken by dark plating and rain. Their rifles tracked independently, slower, wider arcs, secondary lines covering what the pods did not. One sniper settled and held, crosshair fixed clean between Shai's eyes, the gunner's finger resting on the trigger, waiting. Storm cloud closed around the mid-pillar height, cutting the castle off from the kingdom below. A darker layer covered the sky above as it began to drizzle. A woman in a glass mask stepped from behind the ring of soldiers. A hexagonal respiratory hose emerged from her cheek and wrapped back to an octahedral pack on her spine. She came to Emperor Velethion and handed him the free end of a rope, flattened like a robe belt. Then she tugged it in precise, surgical motions that gave language to the line. Learned their tongue through and through. King Shai Condor welcomes you, Emperor Velethion. I have learned their tongue through and through, and will translate his words to you. She spoke without words while water shed down her helm. Shai's eyes never moved from Hark. I have worked with the best linguists they have. I trust her to carry your words to King Condor. She signed it through the rope, gesturing toward the king. Huck's eye caught a blindfolded woman standing just behind him with her head bowed. Lightning flashed below. Thunder rolled across the dock as rain began to strike it hard. Far back in the mothership's cabin sat a dark, windowless room. An operating table stood at its center. Blankets covered the patient entirely, but for the back of the neck, where the spine and brainstem lay exposed mid-operation. A team of doctors worked around the table in haste. All wore white scrubs, masks, and caps. Blood sprayed from the incision. A doctor's goggles went red. "New bleed," he said. He turned with his arms raised in L's, forceps still in his right hand. A nurse wiped his goggles with a rag. "Commencing new transfusion," said the lead nurse, finishing an 4 in Vera's leg. She ran the line through her fingers as the blood moved against its natural course, fed from a hanging bag of dark red iron. She raised it, drew down a holder arm from the ceiling, and fixed it into the claw-like housing at the arm's end. A repeating noise like an air pump sounded as the mechanical hand began to gently squeeze the bag in pulses. "It's because she's actively in bind," said a woman doctor, running a stitch down the bleed. The nurse's eyes tracked the line as the red reached the puncture and took. "Vera, unbind now." "No," said another doctor. "She can land the owls, but she'll lose the subject if she unbinds from him now." He stepped up beside Vera and kept beside the sheet covering her head. "Vera, do you feel your grip tightening?" he asked. Another burst of blood sprayed from the worksite. "More gauze," said the woman at the neck. "Vera?" he asked again. "It increases when I'm not distracted." Vera's pained voice echoed through the respirator at her mouth. The doctor stood and went back to work. Vera groaned as a needle entered the open wound. Then she went quiet and resumed focus. She navigated the kingdom below through 4 sets of eyes. Her owls fell through branches of great red and yellow leaves as they resumed their dive down the pillar's length. At its base they split, to each cardinal direction through the city draped across it. Inside the castle, the meeting room carried the same red and yellow through the drapes, the tiling, the tablecloth, even the drinks. The Condoran royals sat on one side, King Rakondor centered, Prince Rakondor at his left, the blindfolded woman at his right. On the table before her lay an ovular pad of clicking buttons, like a one-handed keyboard. Above them hung a lantern of glass and brass, obelisk-shaped and suspended from a brass tube. Its base widened into an oblate cage for the fire. Above that, in the narrowing throat where the flames climbed, charred skeletons sat inside it. The whole thing had the look of a great, hanging furnace. The Velethion party sat opposite the rest. Huck centered, Ceres at his right, the limping Nort at his left, his head leaned in the chair at an unnatural angle. Behind Huck stood the masked translator, holding the signal rope with him. The other cliff Norts sat to either side of the group, one beside Ceres, one beside the Nort, who had already begun struggling to pull rope and tying tools from his person. "Who's in the lantern?" Hack asked through his mask, pointing to it. The woman with the tablet clicked his words into translated percussion. Behind him, the translator tugged, Condoran percussion. Hack watched Shy while he listened to the pattern of the clicks. Then Shy answered, "Kekatakembra risk." The translator tugged it back to Hack, the damned Iskan Baroness. Ceres's eyes stayed fixed on the blackened skull screaming behind the glass above. "You make a vicious and proud display of your victory. My people once also participated openly in the black rituals," said Huck. The blindfolded woman clicked as he spoke. "I too have an enemy that needs defeating. This is why my army holds the East Tail's northern peaks. This is why I supported your rebellion, which succeeded through my support and through your leadership of a fractured people." Shy did not smile. At Huck's left, the subject began trying to tie line law. The movements were jagged and imprecise at first, then steadied as the cord cinched through his hands and knots began to appear down the line. Shy watched it happen. "Shomkira?" he asked, confused. The translator tugged to Hack. "What is he doing?" "We are a record people," said Hack. The blindfolded woman turned his words into controlled chatter. "He ties what is spoken between us." She hesitated for a beat, then gave the percussion. Shy's eyes moved to her. Hack looked down at the knots forming on the table. A line of them had already gathered there in different shapes, reading, "Launch-ready hull count. The highborn dealt with highborn and commanded the lowborn. The highborn dealt with highborn and commanded the lowborn." King Rakondor had given agency to those at his disposal to do as they pleased with the lowborn Iskan. "But the loudest cries will come from the castle." The owls spread from the pillar's base and began their scan. Across the rooftops, the message repeated. Yiskan bannermen were clamped to their own flagpoles. Cliff knots were fixed to their spires, bodies inverted and broken into the same deliberate geometry, set to face the lanes and courts below. The pattern carried from district to district, a language written in posture and placement. The owls passed over them without pause, marking count and position as the city turned beneath them. They scanned the many X's, marking brutal victory, unlike vultures. The four split wider, threading through the red and yellow infrastructure and out toward the flotilla yards on different sides of the island. Buildings shifted in form beneath them, some domed and spike-crowned like mace heads, others rising into tall pyramidal steeples as the yards came into view. One owl glided over a street that still showed Iskan colors beneath the fresh red and yellow paint, the wet coat not yet set in that section. Farther down, townspeople were packing up their brushes and pots as the rain came on hard. Deeper into that quarter, the old Yiskan black and chrome still held. The spiked domes shone in metal. The buildings beneath them were black. At the coast, a harvester harbor sealed its seaward gap. When open, its mouth broke into a sea and let the sea flood the circular basin. When it closed, the updraft took hold, and the water inside burst upward and out. The owl dove, piercing down through the column of wind that fought its fall. It dropped through the cylindrical shaft and below the sky lake into the storm that always rumbled there. The cliff face ran up and faded into the dark. Condor was not an island. It was a mountain peak joined to the ridge line that held the rest of the eastern spine. Lightning struck in the cloud layer that held the floating lake. The flash ran across the wet seawall, then died, and the wall went on down beyond what the light could show. The other three owls tallied the war-ready zeppelins. The flotilla yards still bustled through the heavy rain. Winch lines lifted pallets of material into belly cabins. One owl arced around the hull of a ship as two cliff noughts dropped through the floor aperture in its cabin. They stood to the pegs of their spires and fell like darts. Their canopies bloomed to reverse cones to control the descent. 10 feet from the ground, they slammed them down to bowls and checked hard. They stepped free before the bottom spike struck. The shafts retracted to half-length. They racked them to their backs and walked down the street. Another owl flew the strata over the water, using the zeppelin hulls for shelter from the rain. Ahead, a cliff-nought stood on the crown of a zeppelin with his full-length spire held at his hip, shaft crossing his body clean and square from the owl's view. Directly above him hovered a larger zeppelin. A circular opening in the floor of its belly cabin sat in line with him. A deep hum came from the ship above. Rain shedding off its hull began to draw inward, feeding a wind vortex that led into the circle. The cliff-nought brought his spire vertical in front of him, foot pegs climbing the shaft. The top and bottom spikes were red and yellow spearheads. Just below the top spike, the folded canopy sat as a striped red and yellow bulb. His right foot found the canopy control cage, the low right peg. He tipped his ankle forward, unlocked it, and slid the cage up the shaft. The canopy bloomed to a deep bowl. It caught the vacuum. His left foot found the opposite peg, and he shot upward into the belly of the zeppelin above, slamming the canopy shut a few feet below the aperture. The hum died. The owl circled below and watched. Up high in the castle, the prince watched the masked princess across the table. Neither had the whole conversation. Each caught only one half and searched the other's eyes for the rest. "You speak as if Condor's enemies are defeated," tugged Hack's translator as Shai went on. "Recondor shonis rocholion huid kartasog reo haina gehes," he said in his native tongue. The signal rope moved in Hack's hand. Condor does not build a sky navy for mercenary duties. Riskor gashapor hin gebraz or risa arsaith hin gebraz sad. Again the line gave him sense. Iskor holds the western spine, and still Isle Ashith. Shai put his fist to his heart and patted once. Rakom Rakondorman, the birthplace of my people. Hack eyed the now steady work of the pseudo-cliff knot at his side. The knots read 37 after launch-ready hull count. On the visiting side of the table, every respirator made noise as air passed through it, except the knotting man's. Shai kept speaking while Hack's attention drifted. More message emerged as the line filled with knots. Test of vortex vacuum lift into Zeppelin spire dock observed. No assistance from spire propulsion or blow duct. Successful solo lift. By Spireman Concave Bloom. Approximate ascension 50 meters. Recondo Rashahaina Rakahana Redethia Huijimeri. Hack shifted in his chair as the next translation came through the rope. Condor will not spend its strength. Condor will not spend its strength for the sake of your empire. Saad, Keldra Condor Kermesh, let Undrak or Fomker, or Numa Rizogash Upor Kergerezu. Still, children of Condor live in bondage south beyond the horizon, and west across the valley water. Sorta Cremon, Euro Numeresmon. You are a record people. We are a blood people. Uri dema hin go fioris arsohida, uroferma. Recondo shol kermish keldra, raiskar kafrosh let hin avilathia hidgioras. I am grateful for your support in my cause. Condor shall gift Velatia all Iskan prisoners still of age for readjustment. Hack's owl helm turned slowly toward the princess. Firelight from the hanging crematory caught in her lenses as she and the prince watched one another across the table. Rain came from every direction below the sky lake. Vera's owl was still in dive now, deep down the seawall, its beak cutting a wake through the weather, its body narrowed to a black dart. Even the faintest light came back through its eyes off the wet cliff. Then an orange glow appeared below, small as a candle on a stormed sea. It brightened fast. The owl spread its wings and arced toward the cliff face, missed the edge by inches, and redirected into the mouth of a monstrous cavern split into the rock, a great vertical crack more than 3 miles wide at its broadest span. Catwalks and scaffolding crossed the void in black silhouette against the ironworks burning at the rear of the cavern. Workers moved along them in lines. Mini-zeppelins hauled cargo to high elevations under the roof. 2 immense skeletons stood under construction near the back. Monolithic frames of ribbed iron, stacked decks rising shafts, and curved load members pinned together in sections, their scale too large for any ordinary hull. The operating room aboard the Velithion mothership reeked of bloody sterility. "We're losing her," said the woman doctor at the front line of the work. Blood spurted in regular pulses. Another doctor leaned in and put pressure on the wound. "Vera, it's time to unbind. It has to be enough," another said. He tested a syringe. Fluid spat from the needle tip. "No!" shouted Vera. Tears ran from the corners of her eyes and pooled against the inside of her helm lenses. "They're building," she smiled through the pain. "A mastodon fleet." She let the word out through the chatter of her respirator. In the castle, the respirated woman behind Hack tugged translation into the line. "I am open to hearing any proposals you have. I have given you mine." Hack looked down at the forming line law. The knot at his side seemed to be struggling worse now. He jerked forward, threw the line into the middle of the table, then stood too fast, scraping against the table edge before collapsing onto it. He crawled across the cloth and slithered forward as if his body were losing its order. "Shom Kira Shah!" shouted Shai, pointing. Guards drove their lances out between the seats of the king and prince and held them there. The knot reached the rope again and finished the message before going still. The cliff knots who had helped him inside were already moving. They dragged him off the table. He hit the floor hard. A chair went over with him. Hack looked to the last knots tied into the law at the center of the table. "Carrier fleet, Stage 1 construction 2 mastodons." "Ah!" Vera screamed as the doctor drove the syringe into the side of her neck. The 4 owls came back to themselves. The intel gathering stopped at once. Another doctor hit a button on the wall. Its line law read, "Owl call." A whistle sounded, too high for human ears. It reached the owls above the lake first, then the one that had dived below. At the call, all 4 turned for the mothership. The owl below burst from the cavern into the rain, spread its wings, and caught the updraft. It rode straight up. Above it, 2 cliff knots stood on their spires with their sails bloomed to tight bowls, the same updraft hauling them against gravity. The owl climbed beneath them in their wakes, 2 colliding rain vortices shedding hard water below each rider. The 3 above the surface climbed the height of the pillar and returned to their place in the mothership's entrance hall, the ramp door still left open to the storm. The cliff knots passed through the Harvester Harbor opening with the Owl trailing behind. Their wakes lost volume as they cleared the throat of it and aimed for an aperture in the belly of a Zeppelin above. They snapped their canopies shut as they threaded it. Top spikes found ceiling slots. They hung fast. The Owl curved around the hull and kept on for the mothership above. The tablecloth sat in a crumpled mess. The king's guards held their lances at their sides again. The two leaders stared across at one another. "Like the languages we speak, the airs we breathe separate our existence," said Huck. Clatter followed. "Where you thrive, my kind dies." Ceres looked at the still body on the floor behind her, the cliff knots standing almost over it. Hark pushed his chair back and stood, forcing the translator behind him to step aside. "I propose a union between our kingdoms, an alliance sealed strongly enough to fight for, despite the difference in our origins." He spoke through the mask, while the blindfolded woman clicked each word into the table. Shai listened to the translation, then looked to the small masked figure beside Hark. "Rakembra Avelathia Zada Cregi Mazo. The Princess of Velaethia is here." The prince's head snapped toward her, eyes wide. Then he smiled. Hark nodded, the lenses of his helm catching the firelight. Shai leaned back. "Shah, Rukeldra Kefroshterts hin Lonrashazu, Rekondo dem Orvelathia Rasteria hin Kord Gioraz." If she survives readjustment, Condor vows to destroy Asteria alongside Velathia. Hack gave the princess one last look. Then he looked to the cliff knots behind her. Readjustment. The knots seized Ceres. "No!" she cried as they pulled her from the chair. She twisted against them, watching her father walk from the room. A hand tore the respirator from her face. "Ah!" Her first breath hit. The red and yellow crispies found her lungs and burned. The doors closed behind Hack. Her screams faded after him. The knots forced the princess onto her back as she coughed and cried, mask fully gone. In her failing vision she could still make out the prince's colors as he stood and watched. Shai remained seated, pocket watch in hand, tracking the second hand as it ticked. One knot held a breathing apparatus over her face and pumped the bulb in measured bursts. Ceres fought each breath. Blood streamed from her tear ducts as her face went pale. The fire in the lantern above raged and danced like a red sun in her eyes as she lost consciousness. Inside it, the blackened skeleton went brittle and collapsed in on itself like a tower losing its foundation.